20 seconds. Eight, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
In old-fashioned mythology, the heart was thought to be the very seat of life itself. Even now people talk of being good-hearted and bad-hearted and black-hearted and soft-hearted. But really, when one comes down to it and looks at the heart as a doctor or as a physiologist, it's just a pump. Nevertheless, it's a jolly important pump, because if our heart were to stop for more than 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, it depends a bit on the temperature which our body is kept, then quite irreparable damage would be done to our brain. Now, I see that my audience is alive, or I hear that my audience is alive, because those thumps which you can hear are actually the thumps of the hearts of 4 members of the audience, beating practically in unison, it appears, and there they are. Could you just like to get up, the 4 of you who've... the noise of thunder isn't so much that it's actually going wrong in their chests. You can sit down again. But that their clothes have been rubbing against the microphones, which we've been hiding underneath their jerseys. Well, to return to the importance of the heart, it's perhaps the pulse rate or the heart rate is perhaps the most frequently made measurement in medicine. A doctor or a nurse who comes to see you almost will straight away go and reach out for your pulse, because the rhythm of the pulse and the strength of the pulse are really quite good clues how well you are, because of the central importance of this pump. Let me introduce you to my man in gray here. There's no pretense about him that he's really a proper model of the circulation. But what you will see is that here's the heart, the central pump, with vessels or pipes going in all directions, supplying the tissues with blood, taking away waste materials, bringing nutrients and oxygen to the tissues, and also having a quite important function in distributing heat around the body. Because the muscles, as some of you might have learned in the last lecture, combust fuel, heat is made in the muscles, it has to be got rid of in some way, and the blood is one of the agents responsible for carrying the heat away to the skin, so that it can be radiated away or conducted away into the environment. Well, let us just make sure a little more of the geography of the system. I've got a picture here, which is really as if my chest had been opened along here and peeled back, just to give you an idea where the heart is. Here you see the heart more or less in the center of the chest, pointing slightly to the left. This point at the bottom here is known as the apex of the heart. And if you can put your hand on your chest, and I see many of you are now doing, what you can really feel is the apex of the heart bumping up against the inside wall of the chest. I should mention that there must be very few of you whose heart isn't actually beating at this very moment. Now, what I want you to pay particular attention to in this picture is this large pipe which comes out of the top of the heart. It is called the aorta, and it carries well over 90% of the total output of the pump in our chest. And when I said it was just a pump, I wasn't really telling you quite the truth. It's really 2 pumps, because one half of the pump is responsible for pumping oxygenated blood around to our tissues and organs, and the other half of the pump pumps the blood, which has been through our tissues and organs, through the lungs, so that it can dump its carbon dioxide and take on a new load of oxygen. Now, I said that about 90% of the blood, or perhaps rather more than 90%, went down the aorta. The remainder really goes to feed the muscle of the heart itself. And just as in the last lecture, you saw me riding a bicycle using my leg muscles and using energy in the process, so of course a heart muscle does work all the time. And moreover, it does work whether we are awake or asleep. It beats about 100,000 times a day. And if you work this out over a lifetime of 70 years, you've really got a remarkable, reliable piece of machinery inside your chest. Now imagine you wanted to buy one of these things. That you wanted to buy a pump to do all these services, or even to perform a much simpler service in your central heating system. And you ask yourself, what kind of a specification ought this pump to have? What ought I to know about this pump? Well, you've got 6 radiators and lots of narrow pipes connecting those radiators to your boiler. And so one of the things you would want to know is this pump going to develop sufficient pressure to force the water at sufficient rate through my radiator system? So one of the figures you would look at in the specification sheet is how hard can this pump pump? I want to know what pressure it can develop. And perhaps next to the measurement of pulse rate and maybe temperature, the measurement of blood pressure is the most common measurement which is performed medically because of its importance and the fact that some organs, like the kidneys, do crucially depend on the blood pressure being sufficiently high to allow them to perform their function. Now, if I was a central heating engineer and wanted to measure the pressure of my pump, all I would have to do would be to take a spanner and undo one of the union nuts and put a pressure gauge in the way, and here I have my measurement. Now, for reasons which will be obvious to you, I'm not allowed to do this to you. And on the whole, it's disapproved of anyway that one should puncture the system every time one wants to measure the pressure. So it is occasionally done in patients who are seriously ill. So we have to find an indirect way of doing this. And you remember this whole series of lectures is really about means of finding out what goes on in the inside of the body from the outside without making any holes into it. And I'm not going to make any holes into any of them. Many people are going to help me with this lecture today. So let's look at the next slide to get some idea of how one might go about this indirect measurement of blood pressure. Here I've got a cross-section of a very simplified arm. And down the center of the arm, I've got a large artery. This is a vessel which is relatively directly connected to the heart, down which high-pressure blood is pumped from the heart in this direction. I've put a cuff around this arm. What I mean by a cuff is really something like a section of motor car inner tube, sealed at both ends, and supplied with a fitting so I can inflate it, just like inflating a motor car tire. So if I wrap this around the arm, and I go and pump it up, I can exert a pressure on the tissues of the arm. Now, because the arm is largely made of water or other materials which are incompressible, if I apply a pressure onto the outside of the arm, this pressure will communicate itself to the inside, and if the pressure is large enough, it will collapse the artery and no further blood will be able to go through. So if I had some means of finding out when blood actually stopped flowing down this artery, and I would be able to compare it with the pressure inside that cuff, the moment when blood stopped flowing, or started flowing again, whichever way you work it, I would have a way of measuring the blood pressure at that particular time. Now, it isn't quite as simple as that, because, as I'm sure you'll realize, the pump which you have in your chest is not like a turbine or like the central heating pump I've been alluding to, but it's a pump which is much more like a piston pump in the sense that it sucks in on one stroke and pushes blood out at the other stroke. So it doesn't produce liquid continuously. In consequence, if you are pumping blood into the system of arteries and veins, the pressure inside these will fluctuate. And what I've got here is a picture of time along this axis against the pressure inside the artery along this axis. And as you would expect, at the moment when the heart contracts and pushes blood into the circulation, the pressure is high, and then the heart has to suck in more blood, the pressure drops, it contracts again, it goes high again, and so on. So we have an oscillation of pressure in time with every heartbeat. Now, special names have been given to these two pressures. the peak pressure, the highest pressure which we reach, is called the systolic pressure, and the lowest pressure which we reach at the trough is called the diastolic pressure. And whenever doctors and nurses measure blood pressure, they will always quote two figures, something like 120/80, meaning that the systolic pressure, the peak pressure, is 120 millimeters of mercury, and the diastolic pressure is 80 millimeters of mercury. And I'd just like to tell you a little anecdote about these millimeters of mercury. I'm sure that many of you will have had your blood pressure measured in the surgery of a doctor, where the cuff was put around your arm, and you saw a little mercury column rise to a height of about this sort of distance. And the length of this mercury column was measured in millimeters of mercury. But as you know, there are now people who want to introduce new units into science called the SI units, and they want to do away with the millimeter of mercury and replace it with a unit called a Pascal. And blood pressures will come out as some queer number of kilopascals. Now, some doctors are annoyed about this and have formed a society for the preservation of the millimeter of mercury. Because it's quite easy to imagine how long that column of mercury is. It's really much more difficult to imagine what 14.7 kilopascals or whatever the blood pressure is really signifies. And I must say I thoroughly agree with the conservatives in this case who want to keep a nice, intelligible measurement. Right. Now, how can we go about doing this? And let me introduce you first to my model arm here. What I've got here is a heart. You could think of this as being the heart as for the moment supplying a constant blood pressure. That's the difference in level between here and here. Here I've got my arm. It happens to be made of glass. And inside the arm, I've got an artery, which is made of a flabby piece of rubber tubing. Now, instead of wrapping a cuff around the arm, as I showed you on my slide, I can arrange to increase the pressure of the water which surrounds my model artery here. But it comes to exactly the same thing, because I told you that compressing the outside of the arm is really just a way of transferring the pressure to the artery on the inside of the arm. Here I've got a pressure measuring device, a manometer, which is just like our column of mercury. But because the column of mercury would only be about that long, you would have difficulty in seeing it, we've made a column of water here. And water is 13 times lighter than mercury, so we have to have a very much taller column. So you'll be, by watching the water level in here, you'll be able to see the pressure which I'm exerting on here. And now for the first time, I'm going to inflate this, just as I was inflating the cuff around the arm. And what I would like you to do is to watch the fate of this artery in here. Pressure is going up. You can see the water level rising in here. And as it gets to the point, roughly speaking, level with the beaker, as it is now, you see the artery is collapsed. If I let it down again, the artery expands again. Now, if I actually now turn on the blood, because I pretended there's a tourniquet on the end of my arm, if I make my patient bleed, here you are, into the beaker, please, patient, and I now go and increase the pressure to a level which is above the beaker pressure, it stops, because I've closed the artery off, just as I described to you on the slide. If I allow the pressure to drop again, the blood flow starts again. Now, I've arranged with a young lady called Rebecca to be a heart. But I've arranged with her to be a very, very slow heart, like a tortoise heart, or perhaps even a dinosaur heart, because I should imagine that the Loch Ness Monster has really got a very low heart rate if it's managed to live as long. So I'm going to ask Rebecca now to lift the beaker up and down very slowly, so producing a systolic and a diastolic pressure, systolic, diastolic pressure, and let's see what happens to the blood flow. Here, my patient's bleeding again. Now just hold it at the diastolic level for a moment. Blood flow stopped. Right, now go systolic. Blood flow starts again, so pretty slowly. The aim is jolly bad. Right, now go diastolic again. There we are, blood flow stops. Up again, systolic again. But I can beat Rebecca, because if I inflate my thing above systolic, higher than she can reach, she can't expand the artery. And this is precisely what we do. We find that spot in pumping up the cuff when we can just start the blood flow again. If you just hold it there steadily, if you can bear it. I'm now going to drop the pressure gently. And at some stage, we're just beginning to start bleeding again. There we are. And as the pressure goes down, blood starts to flow. Right. You can persist being a dinosaur heart. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And we are now going to do this actual measurement of actually measuring the blood pressure of a patient on somebody called Andrew. Right, Andrew? I think you have to take your pullover off. Thank you. And can you roll your sleeve up so I can get at your upper part of your arm? Now, what I'm going to do is to put a rubber cuff, just like the piece of car inner tubing around his arm. And remember, inside his arm is his brachial artery. All right. And then below that, I'll put my microphone here. I've got a special microphone, the same microphone which I can use just to pick up heart sounds. And I'm going to put that at this part of his arm here, because instead of actually cutting off his finger to see whether blood comes out at the end or not, and I did actually bring myself a device for cutting off fingers, like that. It doesn't really seem doesn't seem to work properly. So we had a finger left from this morning's rehearsal. Instead of actually cutting off his finger and seeing whether the blood dribbles out of the ends of the finger, you can listen to the sound which the flowing blood makes by putting a microphone on the inside of the arm here. And I'm going to put a sensitive microphone on there. That. And then I'm going to pump the cuff up. And I'll ask you to listen very, very carefully when I let the pump down again, because the sounds are going to be very faint and difficult to hear. So I'm going to pump the cuff up now to a pressure which I would expect to be above Andrew's systolic blood pressure. I should think something like 120 or 130. Now, at this pressure, I would expect the blood flow through his arm to stop completely. And I'm going to let it down very slowly now, and I want you to listen very carefully. Can you hear the soft thumps? Now, I'm going to continue to let the cuff down. Still there. Stopped. Stopped at about 75. Now, it is these two figures. The figure where the sound first starts, which is known as the systolic pressure, and the pressure where the sound stops, which is known as the diastolic pressure. I wonder if we can just quickly do it again, because it isn't often one gets it so relatively clearly. Can you stand it once again, Andrew? Right. These sounds, incidentally, are called Korotkov sounds, after a man called Korotkov, not because it's a sound, Korotkov, Korotkov, Korotkov. So it's a good way of remembering it. Now, we would expect them to start at about 100, didn't we? There they are. Stopped, 75. It's about 100 over 75. It would appear to be his blood pressure. Now, don't go away, Andrew. I'm just going to take the microphone off you. And I'm going to show you another piece of equipment which rejoices in the name of a photoplethysmograph, which is the next best thing to cutting his finger off, because it will actually tell us whether blood is flowing through the tip of his finger. And here's the piece of equipment. It's a very simple piece of equipment. It consists of no more than a little metallic molding, which is fitted with a light on one side and a photocell the other side. If you look at this slide, this is how it operates. Here's a cross-section of the finger, rather diagrammatically. And the finger is, of course, full of tissue. And the tissue is well supplied with small blood vessels called capillaries and small arteries, which will, of course, change their diameter in response to the change in blood pressure. So every time we go up to the systolic blood pressure, they swell slightly. Every time we drop down to the diastolic pressure, they contract slightly. Now, the amount of light will be reflected from the inside of the finger will be modulated by this change in diameter of the blood vessels. And I hope to be able to pick this up by putting this round Andrew's finger, with your forefinger, like that. Can we have the other finger, that one? Right. And let's show it to the camera. I think you can probably see the light glowing through the end of his finger there, right? And that's rested on your. And I'm going to put your pullover over it so it won't get upset by all the lights. And let me just introduce you to an instrument which we're going to use throughout this lecture. What I've got here is a two-channel pen recorder. There's a moving strip of paper here. It's not switched on at the moment. There are two pens which can move over that, so we can trace out any kind of signal which you pick up. And I'm now going to make the pulsations from Andrew's forefinger appear on this pen recorder. Right, I'll switch the chart on. And if you watch the recording paper, sorry, I have to switch it off myself again accidentally. There you can see the pulsation appearing. And you see that they have, roughly speaking, the same sort of shape as those which you saw on my previous slide. And just to show you that I wasn't cheating in all this, I'm now going to pump the cuff up again to above systolic pressure. And you see whether we can make it stop. Because if I'm right about closing the artery completely, it ought to stop somewhere around the 100, 110 mark. Certainly getting smaller. They've virtually stopped because he's now really wiggling his finger. It's quite difficult to keep one's finger still enough. If I let it down again, there it is. And it's really rather bigger than it was just now because his finger was starved of oxygen. The tissue said more oxygen, and in consequence, the actual diameter of the blood vessels increased, and he's got rather more pulsations in his finger now than he had before because the blood supply to his finger actually has increased. Conversely, if I made him stand outside in Albemarle Street, as some of you were doing, and getting thoroughly cold, so that the whole of his peripheral vascular system was going to shut itself down, I would get very little signal from him indeed, because there would be very little blood flowing through his finger. Right, let me switch this thing off before. Thank you very much, Andrew. Let me take this thing off from you. Thank you, and take the cuff off you as well. And here you see he's totally intact. Thank you very much. So we have learned how to measure one very important property of our pump, that is the kind of pressure which it is able to deliver. And so what questions should we ask ourselves next? Well, one of the most important properties of the pump is, of course, the amount of liquid which it is able to deliver in a given time at the sort of pressure which we have been measuring. So we want a measure of output of the pump, or cardiac output, as it would be called in terms of when the heart is concerned. But this really is very hard, because we can't just take that big red blood vessel apart and put a flow meter in and join it up again, because this would be a highly invasive procedure, which I wouldn't be allowed to do. I wouldn't be allowed to do to anybody, never mind be allowed to do to any of you. So again, we have to find an indirect way of doing it. Now, perhaps one of the most old-fashioned ways, and one of the ones which fit well into this classification of non-invasive measurements, is to use a technique which is called Ballistocardiography. Now, this has a jolly imposing name, but all it really means is that the heart inside your chest behaves rather like a small jet engine. And every time it squirts out blood, according to Newton's third law, it tries to move off in the opposite direction. just to illustrate this to you, how effective this sort of jet engine effect can be, I've got a rather funny heart here. It's just ready to contract. The valve opens, and away it goes. In case some of you should have missed that, I have another heart. Anyway, it's fun to do. I have another heart here. Now, fortunately, the heart in our chests is tethered, and it can't really, this sort of thing can't really happen to it. But nevertheless, because it is tethered, it makes our whole body move like that in a small way every time the heart contracts. And if you had a sensitive enough piece of equipment, you could detect this. In fact, it doesn't really require equipment of all that sensitivity, because if you stand on the ordinary balance, as they have on some station platforms, and put your penny in, and then stand very still indeed, you might just be able to see the fluctuations of the pointer as your heart tries to make you take off from the platform of the balance. You have to put your penny in first. I expect that there will be a considerable increase in the takings of balances after this lecture. Well, ballistocardiography used to be sort of religion for a time, when very elaborated pieces of equipment were built, consisting of tables or beds the size of billiard tables, suspended by thin cords from ceilings, which could only be used at 3 o'clock in the morning because otherwise the traffic outside would shake them, to measure these really quite tiny forces. And even if one had measured them successfully, the results were really very difficult to interpret in terms of sensible volume readings. So accepting that one can only get qualitative readings, a colleague of mine, Dr. Martin Wright, has invented really a very simple piece of equipment, which gives much the same sort of readings as a ballistocardiograph. And I would like to ask James to come and help me demonstrate this piece of machinery. I see you're tethered with one of your hard microphones, are you? Yeah. Right. Well, I think there's a very easy. Thank you. Right, James. If you can just sit down there for me. And what I've got here, I'll show it to you close first, is a very sensitive, very simple pneumatic accelerometer. So this is a device which is sensitive to small movements in this sort of plane. As a start, I'm going to tape it to the Royal Institution and see whether I can measure the vibrations of the Royal Institution. Yeah, I'm going to tape it onto here. And it should come out again on one of our recorders on the second channel. If I now tap the Royal Institution, I'm now shaking this institution, venerable as it is, to its very foundations, merely by tapping on the desk. Right? Now I'm going to attach this to James' left shoulder, and if he sits very, very still, and this is not easy because there's all sorts of things going on in this hall at the moment. But don't hold on to anything. Just sit completely relaxed. Right, there we are. That's the recording coming up. Now, if you look at this recording, you find quite regular sharp peaks on it. And those sharp peaks, he's moving his eyes. Those sharp peaks are the contractions of the heart. Every time he does this. But because the heart is not rigidly suspended inside the chest, it goes gadoing, gadoing, gadoing inside the chest. And you see the major wave, the major spike, and then an amount of ringing afterwards, then another major spike after that. Now, these kind of signals, of which James has got quite a healthy one, have been classified. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James, for sitting so still. These kind of signals, there's now a school of doctors who have classified these into 4 or 5 different classes, where in class 1, the individual heartbeats are very easily discernible. In class 4, they're really rather confused. which they can correlate with the vigor and health of the heart. So you can really sort of attach an age of the heart in terms of the kind of recording which one gets. And it would appear that with further work, this might become quite a useful measurement in assessing a sort of qualitative measurement in assessing the overall vigor of the heart. However, as I said, it is only a qualitative measurement. And what I want to introduce you to now are rather more quantitative measurements. And all those quantitative measurements use Doppler ultrasound. Now, let me just explain these two words. The ultrasound part simply means that we use energy, which is vibrational energy in material, either air or water or any liquid, but at frequencies which are very much higher than those frequencies which we can hear. We can normally, depending if you're young enough, we can hear sounds up to frequencies of perhaps 13 or 15 kilohertz, that's 13 or 15,000 cycles. In these ultrasound machines, one might use frequencies between 2 million and 5 million cycles. So even bats, which can hear up to about 40 or 50 kilohertz, would be quite unable to hear the kind of ultrasound which we're going to use. Now, the Doppler part is another concept. Now, I'm sure that many of you will have been introduced at school or in physics lessons to the concept of standing by the side of a railway track and having a train approaching you, going past you, blowing its whistle. And just at the moment as it passed you, the pitch of its whistle would suddenly have become lower. Now, the Royal Institution wouldn't actually let me bring a railway train into this lecture room, but I can demonstrate the Doppler effect. This is the effect when the stationary observer and the moving source of sound, if they approach one another, then the frequency of the sound which you hear, which you perceive, is higher than it ought to be if the train had been stationary. And similarly, if the source of sound recedes from you, then the pitch or frequency will be lower than it would have been if the source had been stationary. Now, this effect, discovered by Mr. Doppler, applies quite irrespective of what waveform of energy one uses, or what form of wave energy one uses. It applies to sound, it applies to light, it applies to radio, it applies to radar, to anything else you like. Well, I'm now going to swing this around my head. It will make a sound, and see whether you can detect any fluctuations in it. Now, I'm going to do it again in a moment, but for half the time we'll be coming towards you, and therefore the pitch will be higher, and for the other half of the time it will be going away from you, therefore the pitch will be lower than if it was stationary. Well, of course, I can't hold it stationary because it doesn't make a noise if I hold it stationary. Let me just do it again. Now, if you want a simple aid to your memory about which way around the Doppler effect works, imagine that the source from which the sound emanates is coming towards you. You can think of the waves being compressed because the thing is catching up on itself. The wavelengths would therefore become shorter, the frequency would become higher, and the pitch would be higher than you would expect. Similarly, if the source of sound moves away from you, you can think of the waves being stretched, the wavelengths becoming longer, the frequency therefore becoming lower, and the sound being of a lower pitch than you would expect. Well, if you don't believe all this, I have another demonstration here. And what we've got is a tiny radar set. Remember, I said that Doppler works just as well with radio or light as it does with sound. I've got a tiny radar set which will flood the center of the audience here with very high frequency radio energy. And I want you to sit all very, very still for the moment. Now, will you just all gently lift up your hands, just like that? Now, in time with me, really in time, would you move them slowly forwards and backwards? Now, faster. Now, you're all moving target. Now, even faster than that. Right? Now, this is another example So you just confront it. Come here very quietly. Quietly, I said. Right, now turn around and go back again. Now, faster, faster. Now, what's happened is that you are all being flooded with this radar energy. You're all targets for it. If the energy is reflected from you, then, of course, you behave like a source of the energy itself. So there was a difference in frequency between the energy which was illuminating you and the energy which you were returning to me. If you sit down, if you sit very still, then nothing much happens. How about somebody just in the middle row, that just one child moving their hands, just like that? Now you see we have the absolute ultimate in fidgeting detectors for schools here, that no school can really afford to be without this. It's really quite remarkable that just one of you moving your hands nevertheless gives quite a discernible signal. Well, this technique, incidentally, is very similar to the one which is used by the police for catching people who speed in the motorway, because they set up a very similar sort of radar set to this one. They get the radar waves reflected from the front of the cars. They compare the frequency of the radar signal which is being sent out and the frequency which is being received, just the same way as we've done here, by mixing with one another and getting an output which is proportional to the difference between these two frequencies. And if this exceeds a certain amount, then they say you've been doing more than 70 miles an hour and catch you for speeding. Now, what we've been doing here, you can also do for blood, because we can pretend, I mean, you were pretending all to be blood corpuscles just now, thousands and thousands of blood corpuscles. So imagine a blood vessel as really behaves like a highway for very large numbers of motor cars. Where each of the motor cars is a single blood corpuscle, where they're all moving, roughly speaking, with the same velocity, and we can bounce a sound signal from the blood vessels, from the blood corpuscles, and find out how fast they're going. So let us now do a whole series of experiments to demonstrate this to you. What I've got here is a transducer which can send out an ultrasound signal from here and receive it in the other half. There's really a transmitter and a receiver inside here. I'm now going to switch this on. And first, let me assure you that this thing is not a microphone. It's not a microphone, because you could hear me. But it's in the sound state, exactly the same as our radar set here. If I move my hand and I hold it stationary, you can hear nothing. If I move my hand, and the faster I move my hand, the higher the pitch becomes. Now, what we've rigged up here is a model circulation. I'm switch on the heart. The heart is down here, and you might just be able to see some particles which are in here moving around, pulsing in time with the heart, which is moving. I'm now going. There's a little window at the side here, so I can throw my beam of ultrasound down this vessel here. Now, this is not the noise which the thing is moving. I can hold this against here. There's nothing here. What we are getting are the reflections of the ultrasound from the particles which are in here. So here we have the first step of how we might actually use this for the measurement of the velocity of blood. Now, I would like perhaps this young lady to come onto the front row for a moment to join me. And I want her to drink a glass of water. Now, just stand over here, not with your back to us. Just stand over here, just like that. And I'm going to put some of this goo on this transducer here, because the ultrasound doesn't like traveling through air. And I'm going to hold this to this part down there. Here's a glass of water. And when I ask you to, I want you to take a mouthful of this water and drink it. Right. Now, before you do this, perhaps just move your tongue around inside your mouth. Now just flap it up and down inside your mouth. All right? All right, now go and drink your glass of water. You are a noisy drinker. Right, let me just wipe this goo off your... Here's a tissue. Thank you very much. This sound of falling down the stairs was entirely due to the bubbles. Was entirely due to the bubbles which are trapped in this water, and we were really measuring the velocity of the water flowing down the throat. Now, what I'm going to do now is to take some of my clothes off, not very many, and I'm going to demonstrate this kind of effect to you on myself. And what I'm going to do is to aim the beam of ultrasound past the top of my heart at the bend of the aorta. I don't know if you remember from the picture which I showed you earlier on. The heart was in here. There was this large red pipe coming out of it towards the back of my body. What I'm going to do now is to put it into here to illuminate the aorta, and you see we should be able to hear the noises due to the movement of my heart, because my heart will be reflecting the ultrasound and will itself be modulating it. And if I'm sufficiently careful, I should also be able to catch the blood which is flowing down my aorta. And let's see if we can do this. Let me turn the volume of this up again. Now, remember, this is not a microphone. You're not hearing my heart beating in the sense as you were hearing with the microphone earlier on. What you're getting are the Doppler effects due to the beating of my heart. Now, this device here isn't actually made to look at the beating of heart of adults, but it's a fetal heart monitor, because a baby, an unborn baby, quite early on, after the 14th or perhaps 16th week or so, has a heart of a noticeable size. And by searching around on the tummy of its mother with a transducer of this kind, you can actually pick out the movements of the fetal heart and thereby, for instance, count how often the heart is beating. And very large numbers of instruments very similar to these are now used as fetal heart detectors, because you can notice the movement of the heart using ultrasound Doppler much earlier than you could hear the heart through a stethoscope. Now let's listen to my heart again in a moment, and I want you to pay particular attention to a sort of whiplash kind of sound at the end, which is the sound of the blood flowing in my aorta. Now, what I'm going to do now, a physiological tour de force, which I don't incidentally recommend any of you to do, unless you really know what you're doing. I'm going to hold my nose, and I'm going to close my glottis at the back of my throat, and I'm going to close my mouth, and I'm going to try and breathe out as hard as I can. Now, of course, the air can't come out, so it will increase the pressure inside my chest. I should be able to increase the pressure inside my chest to a point when the blood can't get back into my chest, for my legs, for instance. And so my heart will quite quickly run out of blood to pump. And just in consequence, there won't be any cardiac output. And part of the sound which you've been hearing should become softer and softer and softer, and possibly even disappear. I hope that some of you are good at resuscitation. So obviously I can't speak while I'm doing this, and I'm not going to do it again either. So you will have to listen the first time. What I'm going to do, I'm going to close my nose, close my mouth, breathe out as hard as I can, and I want you to listen to what happens to the sound whilst I do this. The maneuver I carried out now is called the Valsalva maneuver, after a famous physiologist, and was really one of the first indications which a colleague of mine, who will demonstrate a much more elaborate instrument in a moment, had, that we were actually measuring something which was concerned with the heart. Now, I wouldn't like you to go away with the impression that Doppler ultrasound can only be used for looking at the heart or the large blood vessels. It is equally possible to look at blood vessels which are much closer to the skin. But I would like to show you a slide just to tell you what goes on. What we've got here is a blood vessel with blood traveling in this direction. Imagine, for instance, could be the kind of blood vessel which you can see on the inside of your arm. And we could now, with a suitable probe, send in a beam of ultrasound at an angle to it. Obviously, we can't actually get inside the blood vessel, so as to send it along parallel with the blood. Some of the energy will be reflected from blood corpuscles, and the frequency will be changed by a factor which is related or proportional to how fast the blood corpuscles are traveling. We won't get the full benefit of the effect because our beam is only at an angle to it. For instance, if the beam was absolutely at right angles to the vessel, would we get any change at all or not? Any ideas? No. We got no change at all because there's no component of velocity in the direction of the beam. So clearly, the more nearly we can get parallel with the beam, the bigger the effect will be. Now let's do this kind of an experiment with a rather different Doppler probe, which has been made specially for this purpose, which is rather smaller than the previous one. We've knitted this, and which works at a higher frequency. And because it works at a higher frequency, it's possible to get a rather narrower beam. But the penalty you pay for working at a higher frequency is that it won't penetrate tissue for such a long distance. So it wouldn't be very suitable for the kind of experiment which I showed you just now. But it is very much more suitable for looking at superficial vessels. But I think there's a John in the audience, isn't there, who has got some rather impressive blood vessels. Could you just take your jacket off? And if you roll up your left sleeve, again, this won't hurt at all. All right, so if you just like to sit down. I now have to put the same jelly onto this rather smaller probe. And the first one, which I'm going to try and get, just relax your hand, is that blood vessel which you're all very familiar with, which is a pulse one. There's an artery there called the radial artery. I'm going to try and if I can get this one. You hear it? We'll return to his pulse one in a moment. We can get a rather better signal because it's closer to the surface from the veins which are up here. Just to show you that I'm not cheating, I'm going to cut off his blood supply in a moment. Gone. Back. Gone. Now I'm going to interrupt this blood supply to his arm for a few more seconds because I think you should be able to hear the rush of blood back into his arm. And of course, this is the same as his pulse rate. Let's have another go at his pulse, because I ought to be able to do better than that. Well, seems to be the best I can do. Right. Now, cast your mind back to the photoplethysmogram. What would you have expected? How would you have expected these two measurements to relate? For instance, if this Doppler probe had no longer detected a pulse wave here, would you have expected there to be a signal in the fingertip or not? Right. So we've really got different measurements, different methods for measuring things which are related, so not the same. In the first, the photoplethysmograph one was really telling us something about the quantities of blood, as it were, which were flowing through the fingertip. What we were measuring here was the velocity of the blood. And this is quite important, because the velocity of blood does by itself not tell us anything about how much blood is flowing, because a pipe could be this big, or it could be this big. The velocity could be the same, but the volumes which are actually being carried by the pipes could be very different. So one of the restrictions one must always remember in Doppler measurements is that one is measuring speeds, velocities, and not volumes, and that in themselves they can't be translated into actual flows unless one knows something also about the dimensions of the pipe through which the blood is flowing. Thank you very much, Andrew, for John, rather, for lending us your blood vessels. And now we are going to come to the most complicated experiment, which will enable us to actually put some numbers to a Doppler type of measurement. And I've asked Mr. Henry Light, whose brainchild this machine is, to come along and operate the machine for us. But before that, I'll just refresh your memory about the geography of the situation. Here we have a cross-section of the audience, literally a cross-section of the audience, because if I had taken one of you and sawed you down here, roughly speaking, this would be the picture which I would have received. Here's the heart. Here's the aorta, which we'll be talking about all the time. And you can see rather better on this diagram how nicely the aorta curves backwards in us. It would be rather different in some animals. So this kind of experiment wouldn't be as easy to do in some animals. So if I were to shine a beam of ultrasound from this direction here, it would neatly illuminate the aortic arch. And this was precisely what I was doing when I was doing my tour de force experiment of nearly stopping my own cardiac output. I was aiming a beam of ultrasound in this direction here. Now, the machine which Mr. Henry Light has developed is called, with a rather imposing name, of a transcutaneous aortovelograph. Means transcutaneous means through the skin. You don't have to make a hole in the skin. Aorto means from the aorta, and velograph, I suppose, means it measures the velocity. And it's a way of getting some actual numbers, and with a good chance of converting these numbers into something which is related to flow, without interfering in any appreciable extent with the patient at all. So Emily, would you like to lie down? This is the best way of being a subject during one of these lectures. And this couch, incidentally, is one of Faraday's own, so it's rather an eminent couch on which Emily is lying. What Henry is now going to do, he's got a very similar transducer to the one which I applied to my own neck. He's going to apply it to Emily's top of her sternum, and he's going to orientate it in such a way as to illuminate the arch of her aorta. You can hear the heart. And here you can hear on this, if you could just, right, if you can just stop the recording for a moment. If you look at the recording here, each peak here is the ejection is one single heartbeat, and is a plot of the velocity in this direction and time in this direction. So if I just outline one of these beats with my pen here, like that, this is a velocity against time plot of the blood in the aorta, a very large, deep-seated vessel, without getting anywhere near it at all. Now, those of you with a little bit of mathematics will realize that what we've got here is velocity in this direction, time in this direction, so that the area underneath this curve is proportional to volume, because we've got a velocity and a time. It's proportional to volume, and the only thing which we don't know is the actual diameter of the pipe. And if we wanted to translate this in a rather simple-minded way into real volumes, we'd have to multiply the areas which we get underneath this curve by a factor which would be related to the actual diameter of the pipe within which we have been measuring the velocities. Now, I believe that this TEV method, which really allows us in a very painless manner indeed to get some real information about the effectiveness of the heart as a pump, how vigorous it is in injecting blood into circulation, some idea of the quantities of blood which are being injected into circulation, some idea of the proportion of the time during which blood reaches the circulation and during which the heart fills again. This is a real advance in our way of non-invasively investigating the action of the heart. Now, I think you cannot but be impressed by the fact that for nearly half this lecture, I've been talking about Doppler ultrasound. And I think I would be true to say that a number of techniques which are based on ultrasound, some of them also using the Doppler effect, some of them using ultrasound as an echo ranging method, about which I will tell you during the fifth of these lectures, is one of the real advances which have been made in the application of technology to medicine over the last 20 years or so. And here, to say goodbye to you for today, once again, a sound of Doppler.